the seventh Iker is the Nevuah of Moshe Rabbeinu, the prophecy of Moshe Rabbeinu. Now, I'm sure it's already been stated several times that the animamins that we have at the end of Shacharis in the Siddur are not exactly the way the Rambam sets up the Ikrim. I'll read the seventh animamin, so at least we have that, we'll call it paraphrase, but then we're going to understand better how the Rambam says it. The way it says it in the animamin is animamin b'muna shlema. So I believe wholeheartedly shenevuas Moshe Rabbeinu alav shalom haisa amitis, that the nevuah of Moshe Rabbeinu was the truth. V'shu av lanavim, and he is the av lanavim, literally father. It means the leader of all the navim. Lakodmin lefanav v'labayim acharav, for those who came before him and those who came after him, or those who will come after him. Okay, so Moshe Rabbeinu's nevuah is he's the greatest of all the Nevi'im. He's the leader of all the Nevi'im, and his nevuah is the truth. The way it says it in Yigdal, which also is a version of these animamins, of these ikrim, is Lo kam Yisrael kamosha od, that there'll never be amongst the Israel like Moshe. Again, there won't be any other Navi like him. Navi umabit es tmunaso. He's a Navi, and he's mabit, he sees the tmuna of Hashem, the vision of Hashem, whatever that means. Obviously, it doesn't mean Hashem himself, but some vision that no one else sees. So this is a little bit different than the animamin than the way the animamin says it, in that here it emphasizes what Moshe Rabbeinu was able to see of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and that no one else is like him. So how does the Rambam actually put it? So the Rambam writes, this is actually one of the longest of the descriptions the Rambam has in his 13 Ikrim, but in this one, the seventh one, the Yesod HaShvi'i, we'll read the first few lines. Nevuas Moshe Rabbeinu alav shalom, the Nevuah of Moshe Rabbeinu, v'hu shenamin, we have to believe, kihu avihem shel kol hanavim, that he is the father of all the Nevi'im, the leader of all the Nevi'im. Asher hayu milafanav asher kamu me'acharav, they came before him and will come after him. So that's like we saw in the Animamin and the Siddur. Kulam heim tachtav b'mayla, they're all beneath him in stature. He has the greatest Nevuah. V'hu haya hanivchar mikol min ha'adam, and he is the chosen of all people, Asher hisig miyidiyaso yizbarach yoser mikol mashi hisig o yasig shum adam shenimtza o sheyimtza. And he reached, or he attained an understanding of HaKadosh Baruch Hu more than any other person ever attained or will attain. He has the greatest understanding of HaKadosh Baruch Hu ever. Hisaluso min hanushos, and he reached the highest level of that a human could reach, ad amala hamalachosis, until the level of angels. He reached an angelic stage. And he goes on to explain how Moshe Rabbeinu was able to be uninhibited by his physical self and was able to be able to reach HaKadosh Baruch Hu and be able to speak with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, deal with HaKadosh Baruch Hu in a way that no one else was ever able to do or will ever be able to do. The Rambam goes on to explain that there are four differences between the nevuah of Moshe Rabbeinu and everybody else's nevuah. In other words, there's in four ways Moshe Rabbeinu's prophecy is unique. No other prophet ever had anything like this or will have anything like this. Four different things. Now, last week you already heard about prophecy in general, so this is going to be super prophecy, better than everything else that's come before. So in what four ways is Moshe Rabbeinu's prophecy better or different or elevated from all other Nevi'im? So first of all, the Rambam writes that when Moshe Rabbeinu would get a prophecy, there were no intermediaries. It was directly from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Now, the concept of an intermediary is difficult to, what does that mean, an intermediary between a person and HaKadosh Baruch Hu? For that matter, what does it mean in the Haggadah when we say that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is the one who carried out Makas Bechoros? Lo al yadei malach v'lo yadei saraf, there were no intermediaries. It was straight from Hashem. What does that mean? It's going to be a similar idea over here. There's such a thing as an intermediary and coming directly from Hashem. Understand that all power comes from Hashem. Even his intermediaries are really only taking orders from him. So what's the difference whether Hashem does something directly or whether he tells an angel to do something? Either way, it's coming from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So that we'll have to understand. We'll cover that. That's number one. Number two, second difference is that Moshe Rabbeinu gets his nevuah when he's wide awake. There is no, he's completely as if we're talking to each other. Moshe Rabbeinu is talking to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, wide awake, no sleepiness, no trance-like state. All other angels, all other Nevi'im, all of the prophets, they get their prophecy either asleep in a dream or they're in some sort of a trance-like state. Now understand, the Ramchal points out, and you probably heard this last week already, the Ramchal writes that Nevi'im, when they get their nevuah, it's not wishy-washy. They know what they are seeing, they know what they are hearing. It's perfectly crystal clear on their level. Nevertheless, their bodies don't function when they're getting a nevuah. Their bodies have to either be asleep or they have to be in a trance-like state. They're not able to maintain their bodies in the way that we are normally able to when we are awake and we're cognizant of what we're doing. They're not able to do that. There has to be some sort of a break between their seichel, between their intellect, which is now dealing with HaKadosh Baruch Hu in such a direct way, and the rest of their body. Moshe Rabbeinu was not like that. The integration of his seichel and his body was so complete, he was able to converse directly with HaKadosh Baruch Hu with no trance-like state, no being asleep, being fully awake, fully cognizant. That's number two. Number three, says the Rambam, is similar to number two, but it's a similar idea to number two, but it is an additional point, which is that all other Nevi'im, when they got their nevuahs, they were terrified. They were scared. A nevuah is a scary experience, not scary in the sense of, oh no, that someone wants to hurt me, but it's so awe-inspiring. It's so consuming, as we know from the experience of us Jews at Matan Torah, how difficult it was, how powerful it was, and overwhelming it was. That's what a nevuah does to regular Nevi'im. Moshe Rabbeinu, not so. Moshe Rabbeinu was not scared, did not tremble. Again, kasher yedaber ish el re'ehu, like a man would speak to his friend, just regular conversation, as if kiviyachol, he's just having a conversation with another human being. That's how Moshe Rabbeinu was able to have nevuah with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So that's number three. And number four is that all other Nevi'im could not get nevuah on demand. All of the Nevi'im prepared for nevuah. They were able to get to a level of devotion and connection to HaKadosh Baruch Hu that they could get nevuah if Hashem chose to give them nevuah. But they could not demand nevuah. They could not legislate when the nevuah should happen. Moshe Rabbeinu was able to say, Imdu ve'eshma'a ma'yitzavah Hashem lachem, stand and wait, I'll go check with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. He was able to get nevuah on demand. That no other Navi is able to do that. Only Moshe Rabbeinu is able, at any time, any moment, drop of a hat, he could just pick up the phone and call HaKadosh Baruch Hu. That's it. He's got the direct line. Whenever he wants, he has the conversation. That, again, is something which is unique to Moshe Rabbeinu. So again, what are the four differences? The four milos, the four advantages of Moshe Rabbeinu's nevuah. Number one, Moshe Rabbeinu speaks to HaKadosh Baruch Hu with no intermediaries, which we still have to define what that means. That Moshe Rabbeinu is wide awake. Moshe Rabbeinu has no fear. He's totally calm, no anxiety, nothing. And finally, it is whenever he wants, he can speak to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. These are all about Moshe Rabbeinu's nevuah. Now, Moshe Rabbeinu, being different than all the other Nevi'im, and there never was a Navi in Klal Yisrael like him, and there never will be. The Rambam writes that Mashiach, who we're waiting for, will also be a Navi. The age of Nevuah ended at the beginning of the second Beis Hamikdash, so we haven't had Nevuah in Klal Yisrael for over 2,000 years. When Mashiach comes, he will be a Navi. According to at least one approach in the Gemara, Eliyahu Hanavi will come first to herald the Mashiach, to tell us Mashiach is about to come. And Eliyahu Hanavi, of course, is a Navi, and Mashiach will be a Navi, and he will be one of the greatest Nevi'im ever. But, as the Rambam writes, he will be second in Nevuah to Moshe Rabbeinu. He will not be on the level of Moshe Rabbeinu. He'll be second in Nevuah to Moshe Rabbeinu. So Moshe Rabbeinu's Nevuah is the top. In order for Moshe Rabbeinu to be on this level, Moshe Rabbeinu therefore had to behave in a way that was a little different than everybody else. And this is where we have, and at the end of Parshas Bahaloscha, the incident of the Lashon Hara that Miriam and Aaron spoke about Moshe Rabbeinu, in that they talked about Moshe Rabbeinu separating from his wife Tzipporah. All of us separated from each other, all spouses separated from each other at Matan Torah, but Moshe Rabbeinu never went back. He stayed separate from his wife Tzipporah forever. And Miriam and Aaron spoke about that, as the Psukim say, that why should Moshe Rabbeinu be different? Why should he be separate from his wife? To which Hashem then intervenes and speaks to Miriam and to Aaron and tells them, you're missing the point. Moshe Rabbeinu is a completely different experience. And Moshe Rabbeinu must be perpetually separated from his wife, even though the Torah does not typically value that, to value spouses being separated from each other. That's not typically what the Torah values. But Moshe Rabbeinu is different. Moshe Rabbeinu is in a perpetual state of elevated nevuah, and therefore he always needs to be separated from his wife. Now, what is that? Why is that so? Why does he need to be separated from his wife? What is that? What is the correlation between that and Moshe Rabbeinu's nevuah? So to understand this, we're going to have to go into a little bit the experience of Matan Torah and explain what happened there and the level of Moshe Rabbeinu's nevuah and how what the mistake of Miriam and Aaron is at the end of Bahaloscha, and then we can understand it fully. So that we need to do. Before we do that, I want to cover the idea of an intermediary. What does that mean? And you'll see how this will tie in together. HaKadosh Baruch Hu is by definition perfect, and we are imperfect. HaKadosh Baruch Hu interacts with this world in many ways all the time, constantly interacts with this world. He interacts with this world generally through intermediaries, sometimes directly. What does it mean through intermediaries? Malachim. There are angels, there are different levels of angels, there's different levels of a hierarchy leading from us all the way up to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, from this world all the way up to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And he gives instructions, and those instructions are carried out. When we think about a melech basar v'dam, you think about a flesh and blood king issuing instructions to his people who are supposed to do his bidding. So we understand that it's going to be different if the king does it himself versus if he has an attendant do the work. It'll be different in many ways. First of all, every human being is different, and therefore it's impossible for the king to convey perfectly, accurately, exactly what he wants. Even the best attendant is still filtering it through his own understanding. It's not going to be exactly what the king is asking for. It may be close, but it won't be exact. Furthermore, an attendant is not necessarily physically able to do exactly what the king can do. Maybe he can do it a little better, a little worse, a little differently, but there's always going to be a little bit of a difference between the king doing it himself and the attendant. Moreover, every human being thinks for himself or herself, and the attendant could inject their own ideas into what the king is demanding. The emphasis could be a little different. The slant can be a little different. There could be slight nuances, maybe great ones, but at least slight ones that could happen. None of this should happen when HaKadosh Baruch Hu instructs a malach, an angel, to do his bidding. HaKadosh Baruch Hu will convey precisely what he wants. HaKadosh Baruch Hu created the malach, and he will have the malach perceive precisely what he wants the malach to perceive. The malach is instructed to do precisely what HaKadosh Baruch Hu tells him to do and will not deviate from it. The malach will therefore, he is a malach at the end of the day is a very highly programmed robot. A malach does not have bechira, does not have free will, at least not the way that we think about it, not the way the human beings do. There may be some slight, some unusual cases where a malach is given the ability to have free will, but that's only when HaKadosh Baruch Hu gives him that chance. Typically, a malach does not have free will, and he does whatever it is Hashem tells him to do. So there shouldn't be any difference between HaKadosh Baruch Hu doing something, quote unquote, himself, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu doing something through a malach. A malach is simply a robot who does precisely what he's programmed to do. So what's the difference whether HaKadosh Baruch Hu does it directly or indirectly? And the answer to that question is as follows. Because when we think of directly and indirectly, something which is done directly will be perfect, not perfect in the sense of perfect the way it should be, but perfect in the sense of it will be perfectly what the king wanted it to be. If the king does it himself, he will do it perfectly by definition, not because he's perfect, but because he will do what he wants to do. So it will be what he wants it to be, or at least what he can make it to be. That's if the king does it himself. By having somebody else do it for him, it's going to be imperfect, which means it won't be precisely the way the king envisioned it. It won't be precisely what the king said. There'll be some, at least nuanced, maybe more than nuanced differences between what the king said and what actually happens, because it's being done through an intermediary. And the greater the chain, you tell one intermediary, he tells another, then the less perfect it will be. HaKadosh Baruch Hu has the same system, but it's not because it's inherent. It's because he programmed it that way. When he does it himself, it is perfect. It is precisely the way it should be. And here it means true perfection, absolute perfection. When he does it through an intermediary, then he builds in imperfection because it's being done through an intermediary. The whole point is there's distance between HaKadosh Baruch Hu and what is going on. Distance between us and HaKadosh Baruch Hu. When there's distance, then it will express itself as imperfection. It's a little different than what we're talking about with a king, because the imperfection is programmed imperfection, which means, if you think about it, it's really perfect, right? It's perfect that it's imperfect. Okay, but the point is, it's not the same thing as HaKadosh Baruch Hu doing it himself. When he does it himself, he does it perfectly. When he uses an intermediary or a series of intermediaries, he programs in that it should be imperfect. How does this show itself? The most obvious way that it shows itself is when HaKadosh Baruch Hu does something directly, it is perfectly midah keneged midah. It is perfectly measure for measure, exactly. And you can see it. There's no ambiguity. Just look at what happens. You'll see the exact measure for measure as it is supposed to be. Whenever it is done through an intermediary, the midah keneged midah, the measure for measure, can be obscured. It is still measure for measure, but it is not so obvious. When the great example of this is when Kriyas Yam Suf happened, when the splitting of the sea happened. That was done directly by HaKadosh Baruch Hu, not through a malach. And when that happened, every Mitzri got precisely what they deserved, and the Jews saw it. The Jews saw the Mitzrim getting slammed, getting slashed, getting beaten, and everything was measure for measure. In other words, if you were a Jew who had been whipped by an Egyptian and you had a laceration on your shoulder, you would see that Egyptian get a laceration on his shoulder in Kriyas Yamsuf. Exactly what he did to you, that's what would happen to him. It was precisely, perfectly calibrated midah keneged midah, measure for measure. Whereas when it is done through an intermediary, you don't see the midah keneged midah as obviously. That's an example of the difference between HaKadosh Baruch Hu doing something directly and through an intermediary. The same idea is brought out over here with Nevuah. Moshe Rabbeinu's Nevuah is precisely the word of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Other Nevi'im, when they get Nevuah, it's precisely what Hashem wants them to hear, Hashem wants them to know, but it is not precisely the word of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, meaning there are some imperfections. What does that mean? I mean, HaKadosh Baruch Hu told Yechezkel these words. The Ramchal writes that Nevi'im also are told exact words. They're not making up the words themselves. They're told exact words from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. But the words are less perfect than Moshe Rabbeinu's words. What does that mean? So what that means, and I'll use the terminology that I heard from Rosh Yeshiva of Weinberg, Zechar L'Bracha, what that means is that the Nevuah of Moshe Rabbeinu is Torah. That is the Nevuah of Moshe Rabbeinu. It is precisely the word of Hashem. It is exactly what Hashem is commanding. The Nevuos of everybody else is not Torah. It's Nevuah, which is great. Nevuah is unbelievable. We should all be zeichet to become Nevi'im. But it's not Torah. It's not the precise instructions of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Another way to say it is that when Hashem tells Moshe Rabbeinu, Breishis bara Elokim es hashamayim v'haaretz, whoever would have been the Moshe Rabbeinu who received the Torah, whoever would have gotten to that level, whether it was Moshe Rabbeinu, whether it was someone else, Ezra HaSofer, the Gemara says, would have been second, was the runner-up to be the one to be the Mekabel HaTorah. It still would have been Breishis bara Elokim es hashamayim v'haaretz. The exact words we have today would have been there also. Wouldn't make no difference. Doesn't matter who that person is, because Torah is precisely what HaKadosh Baruch Hu is commanding. With other Nevi'im, HaKadosh Baruch Hu builds into the Nevuah the signon, the language, the personality of the Navi himself. In other words, the Nevuah of Yechezkel, if Yirmiyahu would have gotten it, would have sounded a little different. And if Yeshaya would have gotten it, would have sounded a little different again. Each Navi would have expressed it slightly differently, not because they're injecting their own interpretations, but because HaKadosh Baruch Hu is giving it to them through them. He's incorporating them into the Nevuah. That is not so with Moshe Rabbeinu. The Nevuah is precisely what HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants to say, no matter who that person is. That's the level of Torah, not Nevuah, but Torah. It's a higher level of Nevuah. It's called Torah. That's Nevuah on Moshe Rabbeinu's level. It's what Chazal referred to as Aspaklaria Hami'ira, looking through a clear glass, instead of Aspaklaria She'ena Mi'ira, looking through a glass that is cloudy. Again, the Navi who is looking through the cloudy glass is getting exactly what Hashem wants him to get, but it's not Torah, it's Nevuah. So that will now lead us to understand a little better the idea of Moshe Rabbeinu's Nevuah. When it was time for Matan Torah, you go through the Psukim in Parshas Yisro leading up to Matan Torah, you see that there was plan A and there was plan B. Plan A was that Hashem would speak to Moshe Rabbeinu. All of the Torah, all the Aser Sedibros would be said to Moshe Rabbeinu and only Moshe Rabbeinu. The rest of Klal Yisrael would be there and would witness Hashem speaking to Moshe Rabbeinu, which means the rest of Klal Yisrael would get a nevuah that Hashem is telling the Torah to Moshe Rabbeinu. That's the nevuah the rest of Klal Yisrael would get, but nothing else. Moshe Rabbeinu would get the entirety of the Aser Sedibros and the Torah. We would get a nevuah that Moshe Rabbeinu is Hashem's Navi, that Moshe Rabbeinu is getting Hashem's Torah. And then he would tell it to us. That was what the Klal Yisrael was supposed, that was plan A. But when Moshe Rabbeinu told us the plan, we responded, Ritzonenu liros es malkeinu. We want to get direct nevuah from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. We don't want an intermediary. We don't want to get the Torah through Moshe Rabbeinu. We want to get the Torah directly from Hashem. Moshe Rabbeinu went back to Hashem and told Hashem this, and Hashem said, that is wonderful. That's terrific. That is great. I'm going to give them this opportunity. And with that, he tells Moshe Rabbeinu a critical statement, Al tigshu el isha. Tell the people they need to separate from their spouses. You see, a regular Navi does not need to separate from their spouse. A man or a woman who is a Navi or a Naviya can be regularly married. Now, they have to be tahar in order to receive nevuah, so they might have to go to the mikvah in order to get the prophecy that they need to get, but they can be married. It's not a problem. When we asked to get the Torah directly, what we were asking for was, we want the nevuah of Moshe Rabbeinu, meaning we want the nevuah that is called Torah. We want that higher level nevuah directly. Hashem says, I'm going to give it to you. You're asking for it. It's a wonderful thing you're asking for. I'm doing it. You need to separate from your spouses, because someone who is with their spouse, even if they have gone to the mikvah, they're not able to be on the level of Moshe Rabbeinu. You need to be separated. And so we all did. And we all went to the mikvah. And we were all ready for Matan Torah. And there we were. And it was terrifying. The experience was absolutely petrifying. And we literally died over and over again. Our neshamas left us. The malachim had to put the neshama back into us. And Hashem told us the first two of the Aseres HaDibros directly, Anochi and Lo Yeh Lecha. We heard directly. And we couldn't take it. At that point, we gave up. We said, we can't handle this anymore. It's too much. The nevuah of Moshe Rabbeinu, which is called Torah, is too difficult for us to handle. We're not on that level. We were temporarily, artificially given that level, but it wasn't us. It was too much for us. And therefore we backed away. And we said, Moshe Rabbeinu, Daber atah imanu v'nishma. You speak to us and we'll hear. But Hashem shouldn't speak to us. We might die. We can't handle it. Moshe Rabbeinu thought that this was a bad thing, that we were backing away from our original commitment. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu told Moshe Rabbeinu, Miyitain, no, this is great. This is good, because this shows Yiras Shamayim. This means they have Yiras Shamayim. And this experience of having experienced this incredibly terrifying nevuah of Torah, that will teach Klal Yisrael, and we will be far from sin. And that's what happened. And so we went from plan A to plan B. Plan A was we would not hear directly from Hashem. We would hear from Moshe Rabbeinu. Plan B was that we would hear directly from Hashem, and then we couldn't handle it, and we went back to plan B. Back to plan A. And now we go back to Moshe Rabbeinu getting the rest of the Torah and telling it to us. And that's why the Gemara says in Maseches Makos, Torah tziva lanu Moshe. We were commanded Torah from Moshe Rabbeinu. The gematria of Torah is 611, because there are 613 mitzvos. 2 of them we did not get from Moshe Rabbeinu. 2 of them we got straight from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And that was the first 2 Aseres HaDibros, Anochi and Lo Yeh Lecha. Those 2 Torah nevuah we got directly. The rest of it was through Moshe Rabbeinu, because his nevuah is that of Torah, nobody else's. It has to come through Moshe Rabbeinu. What did Miriam and Aaron speak about? What did they say about Moshe Rabbeinu? So this again comes from my Rosh Yeshiva from Weinberg Zechariah Racha, who said, what do you mean? How could Miriam and Aaron have made this mistake? They didn't know that Moshe Rabbeinu's nevuah was on a higher level than anybody else's? It's one of the ikrim. Everybody has to know this. Of course they knew that. I will just amplify the question, which is that we all understood the level of Moshe Rabbeinu's nevuah. We got it, including Miriam and Aaron. we got that nevuah at Har Sinai, the first 2 dibros, and none of us could handle it except for Moshe Rabbeinu. They were all there, including Miriam and Aaron, and they understood it better than anybody else. And they saw that only Moshe Rabbeinu could handle it. They all knew that to be on the level of Moshe Rabbeinu, you had to be separate from your spouse. That's what we were told at Matan Torah. So what were they thinking? What were Aaron and Miriam thinking that they spoke about Moshe Rabbeinu? So the Rosh Yeshiva explained that Miriam and Aaron understood that Moshe Rabbeinu's nevuah is completely different than anybody else's nevuah. They understood that, but they thought that just like the rest of us Jews were artificially, temporarily given the ability to get that type of nevuah, which is called Torah, for the first 2 dibros, Moshe Rabbeinu as well was really only temporarily, artificially given that type of nevuah, not perpetually, just for when he needed to hear Torah, Hashem told him Torah, and for that time he needed to be special, different, apart. But when he was not in the official capacity of teaching Torah, of receiving Torah, then Moshe Rabbeinu was like everybody else. Not like everybody else, but like every other Navi. And therefore, he should not be separated from his wife. Hashem steps in and says to Miriam and Aaron, you are missing the full picture. You got it. That Moshe is completely different than everybody else. What you're not getting is that it's perpetual. It's not artificial. Moshe Rabbeinu is always on this level. Moshe Rabbeinu is perpetually on this level. Moshe Rabbeinu has no fear when he speaks to me. Moshe Rabbeinu does not fall asleep when he speaks to me. Moshe Rabbeinu can speak to me at any time he wants. There's no separation. He's always, perpetually on the level of the nevuah of Moshe Rabbeinu. It's not artificial. And therefore, he, and only he, needs to be separate from his wife. He can't go back to his wife. In other words, Moshe Rabbeinu is always on Har Sinai, not physically, but he is perpetually the same Moshe Rabbeinu as on Har Sinai. That's the way he always is. He's perpetually in a state of receiving Torah or passively receiving Torah. That's where Moshe Rabbeinu is. And that encapsulates the difference between Moshe Rabbeinu's nevuah and everybody else's nevuah. Moshe Rabbeinu is always there. There's no intermediary. It's constant. He is always on with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And his body is completely integrated in this, always. And he is able to have this, we'll call it relationship with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, that no one else could possibly have. That is the Ani Mamin that we are saying when we talk about the nevuah of Moshe Rabbeinu. That Moshe Rabbeinu's nevuah is the truth. It is Torah. You can't get greater truth than that. Torah is the ultimate truth. It is amitis. It is the truth. He is the Av Shel Kol HaNaviim. He is, literally means father. He's the leader, the greatest of all the Naviim. And no one before nor afterwards could reach his level. And also, he was able to perceive HaKadosh Baruch Hu more than anybody else. It's a difference in kind. It's not that he's a little bit greater. It's a difference in kind. It's the little leagues and the big leagues. It's a completely different experience with Moshe Rabbeinu. And Moshe Rabbeinu is therefore needs to be separate from his wife. And this will then really lead into the next ikr about the authenticity of Torah. Just keep in mind for that next ikr, Moshe Rabbeinu's nevuah and is Torah, and it comes directly from HaKadosh Baruch Hu, no intermediary, and it is a nevuah that no one else is able to have, and it is defined as Torah, and it is amitis, and it is exactly, precisely what we need to hear from HaKadosh Baruch Hu.